Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. In a locked vault at the Louisiana State Archives, a single marriage certificate sits yellowing under glass. It bears the signature of Jeremiah Aldrich, a plantation owner whose name still stains the soil of St. Charles Parish. And beneath it, only one word for his bride property. Her name was Celeste. She was his enslaved cook, and their union was not born of love, or even lust. It was born of a bet, but the wager that began as a sick joke among Louisiana's elite would end in a cascade of death so violent and so inexplicable that even the newspapers of 1854, newspapers not shy about printing blood, whispered only in code. 13 people died in the months following that wedding. 13. A number that clung to Willowbrook Plantation like a curse. I'm telling you this now because the records that survived, the hidden ledgers, the unsigned letters, the private diaries confiscated decades later, form a map of how power moves under the surface, how elites test their dominance, not just with money or violence, but with psychological games. What happened at Willowbrook Plantation was not an isolated grotesquerie. It was a ritual humiliation designed to send a message. It was about control, bloodline, and erasure of identity. And once you see it, you'll start recognizing its echoes everywhere. In boardrooms, in governments, in the quiet deals that shape your life without your consent. But first, you need to understand the man behind the wager. Jeremiah Aldrich was not a sign of Louisiana aristocracy. He was a predator from Kentucky who clawed his way into the planter class through calculated cruelty. When he married Celeste, he wasn't just claiming ownership of her body. He was staging a public spectacle. Something darker, deeper, older, a power move disguised as scandal. And the crowd of onlookers, those men in white linen suits and women with parasols, watched with fascination, knowing what they were seeing was more than a wedding. It was a declaration of war against an unwritten code of the South itself. If you're still listening, you're already different from most men. You're willing to look at the parts of history that polite society keeps hidden. Keep going down this path with me. What you learn here will not just inform you, it will change you. Because the story of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste is not just about the past. It's about the mechanism of power still moving under our feet right now. Before the wedding, before the deaths, before Willowbrook became a haunted word, whispered in courthouse corridors, Jeremiah Aldrich was already practicing the art of hidden power. He understood something most men never grasp, that real control isn't about overt force. It's about perception, secrecy, and debt. He arrived in New Orleans in 1839, a nobody from Kentucky with calloused hands and cheap boots. But within 5 years he had insinuated himself into the murkiest channels of the Gulf Coast slave trade. He learned quickly, every law has a shadow, and every shadow has a price. By smuggling human beings from Cuba and the Caribbean in violation of international bans, he earned not only cash but leverage over captains, customs officials, dock bosses, even judges. Leverage was his true currency. This is how men like Aldrich move. They exploit the cracks in the system until the cracks become doorways. Then they walk through and slam them shut behind them. The society of old Louisiana liked to pretend it was built on honor and tradition. But beneath the sugarcane and cotton lay a network of secret alliances, financial manipulation, and political blackmail. And it was within that hidden network that Aldrich found his place. By the early 1850s, Willowbrook Plantation wasn't just his home, it was his stage, his fortress, his laboratory. When he made the wager to marry Celeste, he wasn't drunk or reckless. He was executing a ritual humiliation, the kind of act that bound witnesses to him through shared shame. Think about that, a wealthy white planter publicly marrying the enslaved cook he owned, and doing it with a smirk. It shocked the guests, but none of them left. They stayed, because to leave would mean acknowledging they'd seen something that should never have happened. Their silence was his shield. Their complicity his power. This is how psychological control systems work, not just in plantations but in corporations, in politics, in every hierarchy you've ever bowed to. Make the spectacle so outrageous, so taboo, that no one dares call it out. And as the wedding night faded into memory, strange things began happening at Willowbrook, small at first, then catastrophic, servants disappearing, horses found mutilated in the fields, and then the first of 13 deaths. By the spring of 1854, Willowbrook had transformed from a profitable cotton plantation into a pressure chamber of dread. Even the oldest enslaved workers, people who had endured hurricanes, overseers, and yellow fever, spoke in hushed tones about the new mistress of the house. Celeste, the cook who had once ruled the kitchen with quiet authority, now moved through the mansion like a ghost. The marriage had not elevated her status. It had placed her under a magnifying glass, every movement scrutinized, every word dissected. For Jeremiah Aldrich, this was the point. He wanted her visible. He wanted her humiliation to be a living warning to anyone who might think to cross him. But what he did not anticipate was how Celeste would endure, and how endurance itself can become a weapon sharper than a blade. The guests who had witnessed the ceremony began to sense that something had gone wrong almost immediately. First came the whispers of a poisoner, then the rumors about a pact. Letters later uncovered in private archives show that Aldrich had been warned, not once, but repeatedly, by his own associates to annul the marriage, to send Celeste away, to restore propriety, before the entire region turned against him. But Aldrich refused. This was his masterpiece of domination. He believed he was untouchable. But power breeds counterpower. The same social network that had enabled Aldrich's rise also contained his undoing, resentful rivals, exploited partners, and the surviving kin of men he had destroyed. Some of these people began visiting Willowbrook under false pretenses. Merchants, creditors, even a doctor, all of them observing, noting details, spreading whispers in New Orleans salons about the cook wife and the curse. They were laying the groundwork for something bigger, something more patient than open revenge. At night, workers reported seeing lights deep in the cypress swamp behind the plantation, lanterns moving in deliberate patterns, symbols carved into trees, strange charms buried near the kitchen steps. The South of 1854 was not a land of rational empiricism. It was a landscape soaked in belief. Voodoo priests, secret societies, and clandestine abolitionist cells all overlapped in a haze of rumor and ritual. And into that dark, overlapping space, Celeste herself seemed to retreat. She stopped speaking to her husband except during meals. She began keeping odd hours. And slowly, one by one, the people who had mocked her at the wedding started dying. The first body was found face down in the cane fields, eyes wide open, mouth filled with ash. Officially, it was ruled a heat stroke. Louisiana summers have always been killers. But the overseers who discovered him swore they saw symbols burned into his palms, marks no accident could explain. A week later, a bookkeeper collapsed in the main house after complaining of a bitter taste in his tea. By the third death, even Aldrich's closest allies were whispering about curses. But curses were only one layer of the truth. What was happening at Willowbrook was not random. It was orchestrated, quietly, patiently. Someone was engineering the unraveling of Aldrich's world from the inside out. Celeste moved like a shadow through these events. She was no passive victim. She had survived kitchens, overseers, sexual violence, and now a grotesque marriage. Survival had taught her how to listen, how to measure silence, how to exploit the blind spots of men who believed themselves invincible. She knew the back channels of the plantation, the secret tunnels, the hidden keys, the recipes no one else could decipher, and she had contacts beyond Willowbrook peddlers, spiritual practitioners, maybe even agents of the underground networks, moving between New Orleans and the Delta. If Aldrich had staged their wedding as a public humiliation, Celeste was turning it into his private crucifixion. Meanwhile, in the parlor rooms of New Orleans, Philip Deveau and Henry Rochelle were threading their own needle. They had infiltrated Aldrich's supply chain, his credit lines, his reputation. Some of the sudden deaths at Willowbrook weren't born of mysticism at all. They were deliberate acts of sabotage by people who understood his weaknesses and his routines. Broken axles on wagons, contaminated medicines, fake bills of lading that left him owing thousands to creditors who didn't exist. The deaths were not just punishment. They were a message. Someone out there knew everything Aldrich had done and was peeling him apart layer by layer. By midsummer, Aldrich had begun locking himself in his study at night, pistol on his desk, whiskey on the floor. His grand experiment in public dominance had inverted. The guests who once came to marvel at his audacity now stayed away. Rumors of the cook wife and her deadly kitchen spread like wildfire, and still, the death count climbed. By late August of 1854, Willowbrook no longer felt like a plantation. It felt like a fortress under siege. The mansion's high windows stayed shuttered even at noon. The once proud gardens were overgrown, the air heavy with rot and stagnant water. Jeremiah Aldrich had begun dismissing trusted overseers and hiring armed men from New Orleans. But even they didn't stay long. Guards found dead animals nailed to the gates at dawn, cryptic symbols carved into barn doors. And at night, from the cypress swamp, a low humming sound, voices in a language no one could identify, carried through the mist like a warning. Celeste had transformed as well. She no longer dressed like a servant or a bride. She wore plain black cloth, hair wrapped tightly, eyes like flint. In the kitchen, where she once prepared extravagant meals for Aldrich's guests, she now brewed only her own secret stews, their smells drifting upstairs, filling the house with scents of iron, molasses, and herbs no one could name. Even the hired guards refused her food. They said her shadow moved out of sync with her body. They said her voice echoed after she stopped speaking. Whether any of it was real or born of fear didn't matter. The perception itself was enough to break the plantation's rhythm. And still, the hidden hands moved against Aldrich. Philip Deveau and Henry Rochelle were tightening the noose. They had inserted false creditors into his ledgers, arranging for massive debts to come due simultaneously. They bribed a county registrar to discover discrepancies in his land titles. They used their contacts among dockworkers to delay shipments of cotton, making him miss deadlines on loans. Aldrich's empire, built on deception, was being devoured by an even more patient deception. At the center of it all stood Celeste. Neither wholly ally nor entirely pawn. Whether she coordinated with Philip and Henry, or simply moved along a parallel track, history leaves unclear. What is clear is that the night fires in the swamp grew brighter, and the plantation's workers began to look at her not with pity, but with awe. The power dynamic had shifted. Aldrich, once the architect of humiliation, was now the spectacle, and the deaths, 7 by this point, were only the beginning of the price he would pay. By September 1854, the name Willowbrook was being spoken in New Orleans parlors like a curse. Ships' captains avoided docking near Aldrich's riverfront warehouse. Bankers hesitated to extend credit. The same men who had toasted his audacity months earlier now crossed the street to avoid him. In the mansion itself, the once proud dining room was stripped of finery, mirrors shrouded in black cloth, portraits turned to face the wall. Aldrich had begun sleeping fully clothed with a pistol under his pillow. He scrawled notes to himself at night, listing names of enemies, debts owed, men he suspected were plotting against him. His handwriting grew erratic, his speech slurred from laudanum and whiskey. Power had inverted. He was no longer master of the plantation but its captive. Celeste moved like a silent current through this decay. She had claimed a small back room off the kitchen, its door marked with chalk symbols no one dared erase. Workers whispered she was holding midnight councils with strangers from the swamp. Twice, Aldrich burst in unannounced, only to find her alone, staring at an iron pot over low flames, chanting softly. He beat her once, but the next morning his prized stallion was found dead in the paddock, throat cut, a wreath of bay leaves around its neck. After that he did not raise his hand again. Meanwhile, Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle were preparing the next phase of their attack. Their slow strangulation of Aldrich's finances had worked. He was selling off parcels of land, pawning heirlooms, borrowing at ruinous interest. But now they wanted to break him psychologically. They seeded anonymous letters, claiming his marriage to Celeste had been invalid, that she was conspiring with abolitionists to seize his estate. They bribed local newspapers to print veiled stories about strange rituals and death pacts at Willowbrook. The aim was simple: isolate him, erode his credibility, and make every handshake feel like betrayal. And it worked. Aldrich stopped attending church. He stopped answering correspondence. His only company was a dwindling retinue of armed guards who feared the kitchen more than they feared outside attack. The man who once orchestrated humiliation as a public spectacle had become a prisoner of whispers. The plantation that had been his throne was now a maze of omens, debts, and shadows, each one tightening its grip on his mind. By October of 1854, the plantation no longer seemed tethered to ordinary time. Dawn and dusk blurred together under a haze of smoke from the cane fields, and inside the mansion every clock ticked at a slightly different rhythm. Aldrich had begun to dream of footsteps echoing down hallways where no one walked, and of voices calling him from the cypress swamp beyond the levee. His men, hardened veterans of violence, were deserting one by one, leaving rifles stacked by the gate like offerings to a god they feared. Each departure made the mansion echo louder, emptier, more like a tomb than a home. Celeste's influence only deepened. She no longer spoke to Aldrich except through a series of ritual gestures, placing a covered bowl outside his study door, or leaving a sprig of herbs on his windowsill. The gestures were at once domestic and threatening, as if each carried a double meaning only she understood. Workers whispered that she no longer walked but glided, that her eyes reflected candlelight even in daylight. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. Fear had taken on a life of its own. Meanwhile, Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle had moved from financial sabotage to psychological siege. They seeded rumors in the New Orleans newspapers about secret wills, poisoned inheritances, and coded messages hidden in Aldrich's own shipping manifests. Anonymous letters arrived at Willowbrook, describing his crimes in lurid detail, signed only with the symbol of a coiled serpent. Even the county sheriff, who owed Aldrich favors, began to distance himself, quietly instructing deputies to let the Willowbrook situation burn itself out. And then came the order that sealed his fate. Desperate, Aldrich announced he would auction off several enslaved families to pay his debts. Among them were Celeste's closest friends from the kitchen and quarters. The announcement was a final insult, a trigger point for forces already in motion. That night, someone scrawled a message in blood across the big front doors: "You are already sold." It was the first unmistakable sign that Aldrich had lost all control. His attempts to display dominance had turned to pantomime, his plantation into a stage for an execution that had not yet happened, but soon would. The night after the bloody warning appeared on the doors, Willowbrook went silent. No crickets, no frogs, no wind through the cane. The plantation seemed to hold its breath. Inside the mansion, Aldrich sat at his desk staring at a single candle, pistol laid across the blotter, his scarred cheek twitching. For the first time in his life, he understood he was prey. His debts had multiplied, his allies had vanished, and the woman he thought he owned now occupied the center of a power he could neither name nor stop. Even the air smelled different, wet iron and burned sugar, like a battlefield after cannon fire. Celeste did not appear that night. Instead, She sent one of the younger servants to deliver a sealed note to Aldrich's study. He tore it open and found only a drawing, a coiled serpent devouring its own tail. He dropped it onto the desk and stared at it for a full hour, understanding, finally, that the symbol had appeared in the anonymous letters for months. It was not a threat. It was a countdown. At the same time, Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle had slipped their own agents inside Willowbrook, disguised as traders and laborers. They were collecting evidence, mapping the estate, whispering to the enslaved workers that the time was coming. Their plan was as much psychological as tactical. Keep Aldrich sleepless, confused, unsure of who was loyal and who was watching. They even bribed his new guards to leave certain doors unlocked at night, small cracks in his fortress. By mid-October, the plantation's hierarchy had inverted. Aldrich stalked the halls like a prisoner, while Celeste and a quiet coalition of kitchen staff and field hands moved with a strange, deliberate calm. Each day she sent him a new bowl of food. Sometimes he ate it, sometimes he flung it against the wall, but always he wondered if this meal would be the one to end him. And yet, no poison came. The waiting itself was the punishment. Every bite a question mark, every swallow a dare. The 13th death came on a Sunday morning. One of the guards found hanging from the great oak out front, eyes sewn shut. A note pinned to his chest, "We are here." The message was no longer hidden. It was a declaration. By late October 1854, the line between myth and reality at Willowbrook had dissolved. The mansion was no longer a house but an arena. Every corridor a stage, every shadow a witness. Aldrich began moving his valuables into locked trunks, convinced he would need to flee, but the trunks never left the property. Wagon drivers refused the job, muttering about omens and blood debts. Even his creditors, who had once courted him for his business, now visited only by proxy, sending folded letters stamped with wax, never their own faces. The social world that had built him was gone. What remained was a single man surrounded by the echoes of his crimes. Celeste, meanwhile, had become an Axis. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words landed like stones dropped into deep water. At night she stood on the back veranda with her hands clasped, watching the swamp, whispering names under her breath. Servants began leaving her small offerings, candles, coins, sprigs of rosemary, as if she were a priestess rather than a cook. Whatever her exact beliefs or alliances, she had become the gravitational center of Willowbrook. Even Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle, watching from a distance, sensed they were no longer the sole architects of Aldrich's undoing. Something larger had been set in motion. And now, to you watching this descent, this is the moment where you have to choose. Ask yourself, what does it mean to see a man undone not by an enemy's bullet, but by his own architecture of power? What does it mean to witness a system turn on its creator? If you feel the pull of that question, type twice in the comments. The serpent consumes itself. Write it exactly twice. Doing so is not just engagement. It's a signal to yourself. It's a mark of crossing, a way of locking in the transformation that begins when you see power without its mask. Because from this point forward, the story stops being about Aldrich alone. It becomes a mirror for every hierarchy built on exploitation. Each revelation pulls you further into the forbidden, deeper into the machinery of control. The swamp outside Willowbrook is no longer just geography. It's the unconscious of an entire society rising to the surface, and Aldrich's next decision will determine whether he dies in the dark or burns with the house he built. By the final week of October 1854, Aldrich's world had shrunk to a single upstairs study, its shutters nailed shut against the Louisiana sun. He slept in a chair, pistol across his lap, surrounded by half-emptied bottles and stacks of unpaid bills. He had stopped venturing downstairs, too afraid of Celeste's kitchen, too afraid of the eyes of the remaining staff, who now moved like sentinels. He tried to hire Pinkerton agents from New Orleans, but none would come. Word of Willowbrook's curse had spread as far as Memphis. Even his own family in Kentucky ignored his desperate letters. He had become an island of fear encircled by swamp and silence. Celeste, however, was everywhere. She was seen at dawn among the cane rows, at dusk whispering with field hands, at night pacing the veranda while the swamp flickered with hidden lanterns. She was no longer a humiliated bride, but the embodiment of retribution. Whether by intention or inevitability, she had inverted the ritual. The wedding meant to display her subjugation had become a crucible forging her power. And Aldrich, once a predator, was the sacrifice. Meanwhile, Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle were ready to deliver their final blow. They had acquired copies of the forged shipping manifests and the secret ledgers. Aldrich thought destroyed. With these they arranged an anonymous delivery to the state authorities in Baton Rouge. The timing was exact. On the same day Aldrich's creditors would demand payment he couldn't produce. State officials would arrive with warrants for his arrest on charges of illegal trafficking, financial collapse, and legal exposure. A double strike designed to snap his last supports. But inside Willowbrook, reality was already breaking. Aldrich's guards began reporting nightmares so vivid they refused to sleep indoors. Livestock went missing overnight. The great oaks around the house were found scored with deep cuts, as if an invisible blade had hacked at their trunks. The walls themselves seemed to creak with whispered phrases no one could trace. Even without the warrants, Aldrich was nearing collapse. He had begun speaking aloud to the empty room, calling names of dead men. Devo, Rochelle, Celeste, as if rehearsing his own trial. Somewhere in the swamp, drums began to sound. Slow, deliberate, impossible to pinpoint, the signal that the endgame was about to begin. The night of October 31st, 1854, was moonless and wet, the kind of blackness that seemed to erase the sky. Inside Willowbrook, Aldrich waited in his study, the pistol slick in his hand, listening for footsteps. But the sounds that reached him were older than footsteps, a drumbeat rolling from the swamp, faint but steady, accompanied by low chanting that rose and fell like the tide. It was impossible to tell how far away it was. Sometimes it seemed at the levee, sometimes at his very door. The air in the mansion was so still he could hear his own pulse in his ears. Celeste had not been seen since dusk. She had walked out onto the veranda in her black dress, hair bound tight, and disappeared into the cane rows with a lantern. The remaining servants stayed indoors but did not hide. They lit candles and placed them in windowsills as if marking a path. No one spoke. Even Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle, watching from a distance, understood the trap had closed. All that was left was the reckoning. At midnight, the front gates swung open on their own, hinges shrieking. A column of figures emerged from the swamp, carrying torches wrapped in damp moss. They moved in perfect silence except for the drum. Some were workers from the plantation, others were strangers, freemen, traders, maybe even Maroons from the deep bayou. Their faces were painted with ash. Celeste walked at their head. In her hand she held not a weapon, but a small iron pot from the kitchen, steam rising from it like a living thing. Aldrich stumbled to the top of the staircase, shouting for his guards, but no one answered. The men he had hired had vanished or joined the procession. He fired a single shot into the ceiling, a noise that barely seemed to register against the drums. Celeste raised her pot high, and the chanting stopped. For a heartbeat there was only silence, thick, electric, before every candle in the mansion flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the house. What happened in the next few minutes became legend, retold differently in every account. Some say Aldrich was dragged screaming into the swamp. Others say the house itself consumed him. All agree on one point. When the sun rose on November 1st, Willowbrook stood empty, its windows gaping like eye sockets, and Jeremiah Aldrich was never seen again. By dawn on November 1, 1854, the mist over the cane fields glowed like milk. No drum beats, no torches, no sign of the column, that had marched out of the swamp hours earlier. The front doors of Willowbrook hung open, one hinge splintered, the other scorched as if by lightning. Inside, every room stood silent, chairs overturned, windows shattered. The grand staircase littered with scraps of cloth and black feathers, but Jeremiah Aldrich himself, his pistol, his boots, even his signet ring, was gone. In his study, only the iron pot Celeste had carried remained, still warm, filled with a dark liquid that smelled of copper and rain. Celeste emerged at noon, walking barefoot from the cane rows toward the river, her dress damp with dew. She said nothing to the workers who watched her. Some swore her eyes looked brighter, others claimed her shadow no longer touched the ground. Without a word, she boarded a skiff hidden under the willows and pushed off into the current. No one saw her again. Some said she joined maroon settlements deep in the swamp. Others believed she sailed north with the underground networks. Like Aldrich, she became a ghost, but one whose story carried power rather than shame. Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle acted quickly. They arrived at Willowbrook 2 days later with county officials, producing the forged ledgers and shipping manifests. In the absence of its master, the estate was declared insolvent and seized. Land parcels were sold off, creditors clawed at the remains, and within a year Willowbrook existed only as a ruin marked on maps. Yet even the most ambitious speculators hesitated to rebuild there. The legends of the wedding curse and the serpent's night spread faster than any deed transfer. Travelers detoured miles to avoid the grounds. For decades afterward, stories circulated, lights moving among the trees at night, voices calling from the levee, and an occasional sighting of a woman in black walking barefoot across the cane stubble. Scholars dismissed it as folklore born of trauma. But for those who lived nearby, it remained a warning about arrogance, cruelty, and what happens when power is forced to face itself. Willowbrook did not burn or collapse. It simply emptied, leaving behind an echo that outlasted every ledger and every lie. Today, the land where Willowbrook once stood is little more than a scatter of brick foundations and tangled cane roots. The river has shifted course. The levee is higher and the swamp denser, swallowing what remains of the old carriage road. Locals still refer to it as the Hollow, a place where phones lose signal and compasses falter. No historical marker explains what happened there. Only a weathered stone boundary post hints at the plantation's name, carved faintly WB. Yet the legend survives, in stories told at kitchen tables, whispered on school trips, posted late at night on paranormal forums. Visitors who trespass at dusk speak of sudden cold pockets, the smell of iron and molasses, and of hearing a low drum somewhere in the trees. More than one claims to have seen a barefoot woman in black walking along the riverbank, vanishing as soon as they call out. Skeptics argue it's swamp gas, imagination, or performance art, but each sighting matches the same date, October 31st, over 170 years after Aldrich's disappearance. Historians have tried to reconstruct the case from surviving court records, newspaper clippings, and the ledgers that Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle leaked. The picture is always incomplete. Some evidence points to a carefully coordinated act of sabotage. Others insist something stranger took place. The truth lies in a gray zone where human rage and mythic justice overlap. What is clear is that Willowbrook became a crucible of transformation, a system designed for domination inverted into a stage of retribution. Celeste's name appears only in fragments. An 1856 census lists her as missing. A shipping log from Memphis notes, "Oh, one unnamed woman, traveling under an alias," yet her story persists because it gave shape to something people already sensed: that cruelty, when ritualized, summons its own counter. Ritual, that humiliation when weaponized, can also become a spark of uprising. If you stand there now, in the overgrown silence, you may notice how the wind off the river carries a faint, syncopated rhythm. Locals say it's just the sway of cane stalks, but others know the pattern. It is the echo of the drums from that October night, keeping time for a story that refuses to die. A reminder that power, no matter how absolute, eventually meets its reckoning. You've heard the story, but the story is not the point. It's a doorway. Behind it lies the truth about how power actually works. How it moves silently through generations, reshaping men, bending systems, corrupting institutions until the cruelty looks like tradition and the suffering becomes invisible. Plantation economics were only one mask. Today the mask has changed, but the machinery remains. Contracts instead of chains. Algorithms instead of overseers. Screens instead of iron gates. But the principle is the same: control the perception, and you control the man. Control the man, and you control his descendants. What Aldrich built was a closed world of leverage, secrecy, and punishment. What Philip and Henry created was the counter-world. Patience, infiltration, sabotage, turning the master's tools inward until they became his cage. That's why this story matters, because it reveals a pattern. Any system that thrives on silence and humiliation plants the seeds of its own inversion. The question is whether you see it in time, or whether you remain, like Aldrich, blind until the last moment. This is where I want you to pause. Comment, "I claim the hidden ledger," twice below, not as a gimmick, but as a signal, to yourself and to others, that you're choosing to see the pattern. Algorithms run on engagement. Secret societies run on recognition. By writing it, you're burning the code of silence in your own life. This is how we cut through the hypnotic loop of the present moment. Look again at Celeste's arc. Even with the odds stacked to crush her spirit, she became the living breach in Aldrich's fortress. Her presence at Willowbrook wasn't just a humiliation bet. It was a seed of instability, a living witness whose very survival cracked his illusion of dominance. Every tyrant has a Celeste somewhere in his network, a person or principle he underestimates until it detonates his empire from within. And if you've been watching this far, it's because some part of you is looking for that lever too. For the way out of your own invisible plantation. Remember this as you step into the next section. The most dangerous truths are not hidden by locks, but by your own disbelief. Once you cross that threshold, you cannot unsee. Are you ready to keep falling? This is the moment where the story stops being about them and starts being about you. Everything you've heard until now. The secret ledgers, the plantation labyrinth, the marriage that became a trigger for vengeance, was never just historical spectacle. It was a map. Every name, every betrayal, every ritual of humiliation was a signal to show you how control systems are built, how they grow fat on obedience, and how they collapse when a single person refuses to play his assigned role. That is the real forbidden history. Not only that power corrupts, but that power needs your consent to survive. The plantation was not unique. It was a template. You see it today in boardrooms, governments, hidden networks of capital and influence. You see it in the way information is filtered, in the way narratives are polished, in the way attention itself is harvested like cotton. That's why they want you distracted, scrolling, numbed. Because a distracted man will never trace the roots of his own captivity. But a man who learns to read the hidden ledgers, to follow the money, to question the ritual, becomes ungovernable. Right now, you're standing at a symbolic riverbank. On one side, the comfortable myths; on the other, the dark current of actual power. Most people hesitate here and retreat. The few who cross come back different, sharper, colder, awake. They don't look at institutions the same way again. They see the plantation in every polished lobby, every smiling executive, every acceptable explanation for why things must remain as they are. This is your invitation to cross. You've already been falling down the rabbit hole. This is the bottom. When you stand up from here, you'll carry the pattern in your head like a second sight. You'll recognize the traps. You'll recognize the levers. You'll recognize the Celestes and the Aldriches in your own time. and you'll know which one you are becoming. That's the real danger of dangerous knowledge. It makes you responsible for what you do next. If you're still here, then you've earned the right to know the plantation was never just a place in Louisiana. It's a system woven into the world, and the moment you see it, you also see the exits. Step carefully. Step deliberately. Step awake. The reckoning starts with you.